Please take care. This podcast contains strong language and discussions of homophobia, transphobia, violence, and trauma. It contains the voices of people who have passed. Rātou kua whetū rangitia. It also contains tales of joy, triumph, and resilience.
Rights and Realities, Remembering 1986. Brought to you by Te Kāhui Tika Tangata Human Rights Commission. 2026 marks 40 years since the Homosexual Law Reform Act passed. The moment that sex between consenting men was finally decriminalised in Aotearoa New Zealand and a major step towards equality was taken. In this podcast, leaders from our rainbow communities guide us through the changing story of sexuality and gender, revisit the moments that shaped a landmark bill, reflect on the Human Rights Commission's role, and honour the courage of those who fought on the front lines for equality. Episode 1, Whakapapa. The Homosexual Law Reform Act didn't happen overnight. To understand why it matters, we need to go back. For most of New Zealand's history since colonisation, homosexual activity, specifically for men, wasn't just frowned upon, it was a crime. From 1840 onward, people could be arrested, imprisoned, sentenced to hard labour, and from 1858 until 1893 even executed, simply for who they were. For generations, many New Zealanders lived hidden lives. Some were forced into conversion practices to change their identity, and too many lives were cut short by violence and by shame. Public attitudes were harsh and the law was cruel. In 1925, the New Zealand Truth newspaper described gay men in the prison population as unfortunate perverts, claiming even floggings had failed to cure them, and suggesting extreme solutions like lifelong segregation or surgery. Around the same time, people who didn't conform to gender norms were also being punished. In 1927, 18-year-old George Grace was imprisoned for being disguised or wearing women's clothing and attending a girls' college. And this kind of policing didn't just disappear. Well into the 20th century, gay men and trans women were surveilled, entrapped and targeted. Here's legendary trans activist Dana DeMilo talking about police violence in the late 1960s.
If you're different, you don't go near a policeman because they're God unto themselves. You know, there's one here that used to arrest me nearly every night of the week, and he'd push my face and push it and push it and push it into the window until I said fuck off or pig or something. He'd go, gotcha, and arrest it and say, arrest it. You know, that's what they called you, it.
But ours isn't only a history of harm. Stories passed down through iwi and hapu suggest that long before colonisation, Māori recognised and accepted diverse expressions of gender and sexuality, identities we now understand through terms like takatāpui. That history reminds us that exclusion wasn't inevitable, it was imposed. In this episode, takatāpui scholar and artist Professor Elizabeth Kerekere and Professor of Gender Studies Professor Chris Brickell take us through that journey, from pre-colonial understandings of identity, culture building and urban migration. And they ask, what can this history teach us about who we are?
Kia ora, Elizabeth. It's so cool to meet you. I've been keeping an eye on your work for a while, and we haven't met, so it's great to be chatting today. I'm really excited about this.
Oh, kia ora, Chris. I feel the same. I'm a big fan of your work. Your work's on my library shelf, and I cite you. And so this is cool. I've been looking forward to hanging out with you today.
Could you tell us a little bit about the pre-colonisation context? So what was life like for takatāpui at that point in time?
It's so easy to romanticize what life might have been like for us prior to colonisation, but there were things that we know about. We had our own language. We had control over all of our land in our own country, and we were able to live our culture. And so the evidence we have for what life was like in pre-colonial times for people that we now call takatāpui, and using takatāpui in the broader sense of how we've reclaimed it, to embrace all Māori with diverse gender identities, gender expressions, sexualities, and innate variations of sex characteristics. Back in the day, we had no need for such terms because the evidence that we've been able to find, particularly in the research of Ngahuia Te Awe Kōtuku, who studied more tiatia and other Māori narratives, and my own work on whakatauki. So many other scholars have done work about the place of sexuality generally. We're a very sex-positive culture as Māori, and we know this from the way that the English and other settlers reacted when they came here. So if we look at our evidence as being in those Māori narratives and then in the European records of what they found when they got here. And then, of course, gradually we learnt how to write because we were an oral culture. All of ours were oral traditions and waiata and in art and in storytelling. And so what we've been able to find is evidence that shows the expression of sexuality, whether that was with one or more people, whether that was with somebody of their own or a different gender, that these things were sung about, they were written about eventually, and that it was just normal, that who somebody wanted to be with was their choice. There was still that cultural and survival imperative to continue our people, so you were expected to have children, but it was very clear that once that obligation was done, you could be with who you wanted to be. So there was choice, there was fun, and we have not found anything, neither Ngahuia or I or anyone else that I'm aware of who's done work in this space, have found any evidence whatsoever that there was ever any punishment for this behaviour. But on the other side, there were no parades, there was no celebration of people like us because we were just normal. I've often shared this story about when I came out and I hitchhiked up to Gisborne to tell my great-grandmother, who was born in 1903. And once I could explain to her what lesbian actually meant, she just said, oh, like my aunties. And I said, what do you mean? And so her aunties, who were born in the late 1880s, lived together as couples. And so they were still living together as a couple and when my nan was growing up. And I said to her, what did you call them? She's like, what do you mean? And I said, what was the special name for women like that? And she goes, we didn't have a name. They were just part of the whānau. And that's why all my work and my first resource, Takatapui, part of the whānau, it's like we were just normal. What they were doing wasn't special, it was normal. And so that is the bedrock that I have established my research, my thinking, my advocacy on the word of my great-grandmother, firstly, but also that reaching back into history, that it was just normal and part of our culture. And all my advocacy, my research and work is to say, we will reclaim back what we had. We don't need anything new. We want what we had, what is normal for this country and this land. Now, one of my marae, Takipu, out in Te Karaka outside of Gisborne, is a marae which features carvings, our whakairo, of people we would call intersex. And I was aware of one of them, and then it turns out there are multiple of those. But it turns out that actually people who were intersex did have special roles. And one in particular appears to have been a tohunga for our people. And I'm doing a lot more research about that before I make definitive statements. But is the only evidence that I've ever found or been aware of where actually being takatapui in that particular way was considered very, very critical. And in the words of Rose Pere, when Māni Mitchell stood in front of a hui and was asked to answer, what do Māori think of intersex people, Rose Pere stood up and said that we knew that an intersex baby was a taonga, was special, and that they had been brought here to teach us. So the idea that adult intersex people might be tohunga really, really fits with that picture. And so when people started arriving, And we know from the English record that they made things illegal. They made things immoral. They were very offended by our open sexuality. They were very offended by the thought that women should have a say about sex, women should enjoy sex, made it a crime, and when they introduced sex work and then made that illegal. And so it's the reaction is one of the biggest pictures and reasons why we know what was accepted because of what they came and saw. The fact that women were leaders, that women were able to have discussions and take part in decision-making. The fact that children ran around and they could be seen and they could be heard. Many, many ways that our people could be ourselves inside our culture, but that new way of being encroached and encroached and encroached on who they could be. And we certainly have evidence here in many different ways of Māori spirituality, our culture and language, of being kind of sheltered by the rest of the whānau so that we could continue learning our traditional ways despite being in a world where the colonists wanted us to stop and were putting massive pressure on us to stop. And I give the example of Rawhioro, which is one of the last whare wānanga in the country, which was in the Tairāwhiti. And we were able to continue all of those practices despite the introduction of Christianity and all of the other very incredibly racist ways of being that we are forced to adapt to and still are adapting to. I'm going to come to you, Chris. Now, you've done a whole lot of research around culture building and the relationship with the state, which is absolutely the place that we were in. It's like, how do we be who we are and live our culture in a place and that is changing? What do you think about that?
I think that sense in which we've always been both controlled by the state and also managed to escape it sometimes in big and small ways and having pushed back against it a bit. And I think one of the things about that early Pākehā culture, that the rural cultures, there were a lot of opportunities for people to forge and form relationships with one another that sometimes came under the oversight of the state and at other times didn't. Certainly by the early 20th century, we see the emergence of kind of what we might start to think of in terms of gay or lesbian identities. And certainly some of the stories are really interesting. Two women who married in Australia and moved to New Zealand and then got divorced. They got married by one of them presenting themselves as a man to the vicar in Australia, came over here, ended up where it was discovered that, in fact, one of them had married another woman at St Matthew's in the city in Auckland, again, by pulling the same kind of trick.
Brilliant.
And so then those two got divorced as well. So their divorce papers are, Florence and Josie and Jean were their names. Their divorce papers are in the archives, right? So they were kind of engaged with the state in terms of marrying and then engaged with the state in terms of divorcing. And then they sort of disappeared in the end. But Josie said at one point when she was questioned, quote, "I'm a woman, absolutely, but with the passions and inclinations of a man." And this was in 1901. And so Josie, we have a sense of how she sort of started to think of herself in relation to her relationships, marriages. So we start to get that kind of sense. In terms of men, by the early 20th century, there was a kind of a culture around the wharves in Auckland. Some of it paid sex, probably others not. And the state started to really pay a bit more attention to what was happening with men's sexuality. Women's sexuality was less under the purview of government. That's why I'm so happy about those divorce papers, because they actually kind of pull that connection together. And by 1917, the government has started quite a long-running experiment which involved sending most men who were convicted of having sex with youths or other men to one particular place, and that was the Big Stone Prison at New Plymouth. And until 1952, most men convicted of homosexual activity were sent to New Plymouth, where they were stuffed in extremely small cells. It worked in the quarry during the day or the gardens, and then at night engaged in physical culture and musical theatre and paper mache lessons. And so this crazy kind of coming together of kind of
Yeah, because that's going to make them all much less gay.
campness activities, concerts, which they played in a manly way in, but I mean, what does that mean? I don't know. And so a really bizarre kind of attempt to create a thing. And as one guy I talked to who was younger said, well, if you were in there, you were queer, so you were there, but you were already in prison. So how bad could it be in a sense, because you weren't going to be discovered because you had already been discovered and were there. Anyway, so complicated relationships with the state, and that went on until 1952. And then men were sprinkled throughout the general prison population, where, of course, lots of other gay men had been anyway. And so that was an attempt by the state to do something. But what exactly, I'm not entirely sure. And there was a whole lot of philosophies and stuff that went with that. But of course, one of the other things that was happening in the 1930s and 40s was a really quite substantial growth in queer urban cultures among men and among women. And so at the point where the state was cracking down, you also had quite a growth of those subcultures in New Zealand's bigger cities, but also the port cities. So there was one Māori man in his 40s who was imprisoned in New Plymouth prison in the 1940s after his gay parties in New Plymouth were discovered. And imagine having gay parties in the shadow of the prison to which people like you would be sent. Like how that would be is kind of hard for us to kind of think about. So yeah, it was indeed quite complicated in terms of what that picture looked like, and that tension between community building and the state carried on right the way through. And when the Dorian Society was set up in 1962, it was set up off the back of several decades of culture building, but decades through which men were imprisoned for having sex with other men. So having come to the 1940s and 50s, the other thing, of course, that was huge in this kind of period was that rural-urban drift and the movement of large numbers of Māori from rural areas to the cities. So, Elizabeth, I mean, what do you think is the big what's the big characteristics of this? Like, what happened there and what difference did it make?
It's so interesting because when you're talking about that kind of cultural building in terms of gay, lesbian, trans, the way people were organising, there were not many Māori around, purely because we hadn't come to the towns and the cities. And so long after Te Tiriti o Waitangi was signed in 1840 and the English Laws Act of 1858, where we inherited the entire legislation of Britain, most Māori and Pākehā still had no contact with each other. So takatāpui were mainly able to live their lives away from that public eye. Now, even though we didn't inherit all those laws, we had Puritans, missionaries, colonists had been in our land now for a very, very long time. And so their way of thinking, the pressure they were putting on to change and modify our behaviour had been happening for some time. Because not many Māori had been into the city, some of that original culture building of lesbian gay communities didn't include many Māori, definitely some, but not many. But we were still being influenced in our own tribal areas by Christianity and what was going on. I like to think that the Tairāwhiti, where I come from, is one of the most sex positive of all of the iwi. And I think that it affected us, not necessarily not so much, but we held on for much longer than other iwi in those things. And that's why I believe in the research that I do and the things I'm finding out from home, it makes us stand out in regards to that particular kaupapa and the prevalence of takatapuitanga here, actually, in the past and in the present. I want to share a story with you of a court case that caught media attention back in 1929, based on the research by Paul Diamond. So, Nikora Hune Holder was described as a Māori vaudeville artist. It's giving strong drag queen vibes to me. But she had been a housemaid for several months in a Pākehā family home under the name of Miss June O'Hara. Quoting the Dominion, but correcting the pronouns, when June walked into the court from the room reserved for female prisoners, she was, and I quote, dressed in a fashionable frock, brown coat, black hat, grey silk stockings and patent leather high heel shoes. Shapely fingers were visible below the cuffs of a dark, well-fitting overcoat. With mincing steps and adjusting a brown fox fur as she walked into the dock, June looked, even on close scrutiny, like a Māori girl. Ringlets of glossy black hair peeped from under the smart little hat. June looked coyly at the magistrate from behind the shelter of her fur, and only her brown eyes could be seen. The New Zealand Herald reported that June's voice was musical, and the Dominion confirmed it was uncommonly feminine in tone, being pitched in a high alto. June's employers spoke very well of her, and Mrs. Kisson in particular refused to believe she's not a woman. So again, correcting names and pronouns, the Auckland Weekly News reported Mrs. Kisson as stating, apart from June's activities as a housemaid, she sang to the children in a pleasing soprano voice in the evenings. She was an accomplished musician, playing a steel guitar, a ukulele, a violin, and a piano with skill. Fancy stitching and other work was done by June with great care. She could also do paintwork and was good at producing scenes on cushions. Besides that, she was a good cook and could prepare food very well. All her actions, her speech, and her mannerisms were identical with those of a girl. She also had feminine poise and was not of a heavy build. In the end, Miss June pleaded guilty to having falsely represented herself as a female. We know little else about what happened afterwards, but that was in 1929. No public outcry, no significant punishment. The judge ruled that there was no need for jail and June would come up for sentence if there were any further incidents, and there were not. So, I just love that story so very much. The absolute detail to the clothing and the looks and the coyness, just respect. But if we come back to our demographics, so by the late 1930s, over 80% of Māori were still living at home in their tribal areas, mainly in rural areas. And although there'd been a slow trickle of people moving to the cities, it was cut short by the Depression in the 1930s. During the World War, of course, in the 1940s, many Māori were enlisted by Tāpirana Ngāti into the Māori Battalion. My grandfather, Baniruru, was one of the ones who joined Company C, which is the ones from Tairāwhiti, and though I never met him, he was one of the few that came home. But other Māori who were not eligible to go to fight were enlisted into the cities to support the war effort. And then, of course, after the war, great demand for labour and, difficulties in rural areas getting jobs. At the beginning, most of those people were unmarried young Māori men looking for a more modern life. My father was one of those. He left Gisborne for the bright lights of Wellington, and he met my mother in 1963. So, again, because I love stats, after World War II, by the mid-40s, only 26% of Māori lived in towns or cities. By the mid-50s, 35%, mid-60s, 62%. By the mid-80s, nearly 80%. So from a trickle to a drift to an absolute wave that's been described as the most rapid movement of any population. And so we came into contact with Pākehā, and three big things happened here. Intermarriage, that I'm a product of, racism, very, very overt, not from the state, but from the people around them as well as the state, and then, of course, transphobia. So all those people coming slowly in a wave over those decades, very much, of course, that included whakatapui. And they came to work, they came to make a better life for themselves, and many of them to be who they were. For our whakawahine, our trans women, the only work available to them was sex work. And it may be known as the oldest profession in the world, but it was not here. Because, of course, Māori thought it was normal. And it was okay to talk about it. It was all right to be good at it. So Europeans had this weird thing where they made sex work part of their lifestyle and a requirement, but then at the same time made it criminal. And we all have heard of Carmen Rupe, who's one of our most famous trans women. And in 1966, she famously won a court case. I think back to Miss June being accused of being a woman. Carmen in 66, in absolute vindication, she won the right for trans women to wear women's clothing. And that was 8 years before the Auckland Gay Liberation Front and 3 years before Stonewall in New York. Of course, she may have been one of the most famous. She was not the only one. I acknowledge Chrissy Witoko and all of those who created spaces for queer people to socialise and be safe in the cities. And just a quick segue, if you want to know more about the history of trans rights in Aotearoa, please read Will Hanson's PhD because it is brilliant. And I want to kind of close off what it was like and just thinking of what you were saying about culture building. It's like we came into the cities, we're figuring out how to be Māori, but as well as live all the different parts of ourselves. And I want to do a shout out to Jennifer Edwards, who's one of the whakawahine from that time. And we interviewed her in our first Takatapui resource back in 2015. And she spoke about how sex work was a liberation for her because she was able to afford clothes and she could dress however she wanted, but she could live her life as the woman she was. When Jennifer passed away, Te Whanawhana took a delegation up to the East Coast for her tangi. And the whānau had sprinkled red glitter on her grave, and we showed the interview of her talking about her life, including her sex work, on her marae to all of her whānau. I think Te Whanawhana's goal is for Takatapui to tell our stories, build our communities, and leave a legacy. And never in my life have I felt the feeling of that legacy as sitting on that marae watching Jennifer's cousins, her mokopuna, watching and being so proud of her telling the story about her life. So thinking about that, about the past and the present and how we draw, what do you think are some of the continuities between the past and the present?
I think, Elizabeth, in terms of considering the way that people have been aware of their social marginalisation back in the 19th century and have spoken up against it in the opportunities when they've had the opportunities that they have had. So, for instance, a young guy called Percy Ottiwell, who ended up in a Seacliff Asylum, as it was then called, in 1891, who, when questioned by Truby King, who was the superintendent, and Percy said, "The Bible says love one another, does it not? Why then can one not love someone of the same sex?" And this was after he was sent there having had a relationship with another young male. Percy was only 20 at the time. And so there's in 1891 someone basically saying, I have the right to love someone I want to love in a way that we wouldn't necessarily kind of think of. Again, in my research, there's someone I can't name because of the pseudonym rules around that particular piece of research. But in 1940-something, when police arrested him for having an intimate relationship with another man, they found a letter in which he argued fervently for the rights of homosexuals and using that language, which had become more popular by the 1940s. So here are people actually saying quite early on, no, actually, I have the right to love as I choose, and there's nothing wrong with it. Why would there be? And so I love this idea that there's a continuity between people standing up for themselves then and people doing so now. And I think, too, as we see now, how much there's still fights that have to be had, and thinking about the protests against the gender definition bill, or whatever it's called, that's going on now, having to again stand up in the face of, well, the state, but as you pointed out before, not just the state, also general kind of public opinion. So rather than seeing the past as a dark place and the present as a light place, we can actually see both of them as mixtures of both of those things, right? So it's actually much more complicated what social change looks like than we might think. And even in the 1960s, when there was still that narrative of queer people being sick, but a minority of people who were considered to be sick. But that minority model then came to have huge influence later on in terms of the minority that is deserving of rights and freedoms. So I think I love the way that the past and the present talk to one another. And I also love the way that we draw inspiration from the people that we're talking about today. And so how our own kind of queer identities are shaped and influenced by those who've come before us. I think that's really significant.
I love that. And something that stands out for me in what you've just said is those people would never have thought of themselves as activists.
No,
they
never.
would never have thought that here I am championing for human rights.
Yeah.
They're just like, you know what? I don't think there's anything wrong with this.
Yeah.
Why do you?
Yeah,
and actually, I question your analysis. The Bible, I am Christian and me personally am not. But people saying, I'm Christian. I know this. I know this story and I believe that love is love. And therefore it should apply to me as well. That's brilliant.
Absolutely. And I mean, in terms of the Bible, you know, both Ruth and Naomi and David and Jonathan, those pairs of people have provided inspiration to generations of queer people. Like here we are in the Bible. So we may see the Bible in different kind of ways, but actually we can also see it as a place where love between people is celebrated. So there are many different ways to read something like that, you know. Those stories have been really significant, in fact. But the centrality of Saint Sebastian to queer culture is just like there are Saint Sebastians everywhere, this biblical thing, you know. It's been really influential.
I can't believe we got that done so quickly. I think both of us could talk for hours. So really, really awesome. Thank you, Chris.
That was fantastic, Elizabeth. I think we covered quite a bit of territory, but we could have covered more. Hey, really nice chatting.
You've been listening to Rights and Realities, Remembering 1986, brought to you by Te Kahui Tika Tangata Human Rights Commission. Produced by The Spinoff and Andre Afamasanga. Recorded and edited by Matt Eller and Ricky Simmons at Evoke Audio. Voiced and written by Leonie Kapia-Hayden and Tane Polkinghorn. Special thanks to Gareth Watkins, Roger Smith, PrideNZ.com, Elizabeth Kerekere, and Chris Brickell. If you would like to learn more about the rights of rainbow people, or if you have a complaint or question about discrimination because of your sexual orientation or gender identity, head to www.tikatangata.org.nz to find out how the Human Rights Commission can help. The views and recollections expressed in this recording are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of Te Kahui Tika Tangata Human Rights Commission.